Hello, history nerds and historians. My name is Christina, and this is Effed Up History. This is where we talk about a little tidbit from history.
That's super fucked up.
Okay, so apologies to anyone who listened to my last podcast. That was terrible. My audio was awful. I knew my mic was on the way out, and I had actually already ordered a new mic that I was just waiting to come in. But I thought I could maybe get one more episode out of it, and I clearly could not. So today we are re-recording the Salem Witch Trials episode. If you already listened to it, please listen to this one. It is going to be so much better quality, and it will not hurt your ears. So initially my plan was to make the Salem Witch Trials the grand finale of this Salem series, but I'm finding as I research these last few stories and writing my notes and stuff, it's constantly referencing the witch trials. And for anyone who might not be familiar with the witch trials, past the fact that they happened in Salem, Massachusetts, it would be such a disservice to you to have to wait, because I'd be telling these stories like related to the witch trials or a more in-depth dive into the specific people or things that happened afterwards, and kind of just like throwing y'all into it without a basis, you know? Can't talk to you more about Giles Corey if you don't know who Giles Corey is. Can't talk to you more about George Corwin if you don't know who George Corwin is. You feel? Are you picking up what I'm putting down? Yeah. So I've been trying to go back and forth between the women of Salem and like the spookier and darker history. So it makes sense to tell the story of the Salem Witch Trials now. So the episode before last was the history of witchcraft leading up to the Salem Witch Trials. So without further ado, today we'll be talking about the Salem Witch Trials. And I am going to take a couple minutes to talk about each victim because they are more than just a name and a wall. And I feel like a lot of people forget that the people who were executed as witches in Salem were actual people. So this one might be a little heavy. It's going to be long. But I feel like it's very important to talk about it because they were people with whole lives and people who loved them. And they had spouses and children, and all of them except for one died proclaiming their innocence. So without further ado, sit back, relax, and practice. Wait, before we do that, we have a sponsor for today, and that sponsor is, this is my drum roll sound, me, and maybe you, because I now have a Patreon. I had someone ask me about it, and so I started one up. There's like absolutely no pressure to join. You will still be able to have access to all of my random, sarcastic, sometimes feminist rants. But if you do join my Patreon, you get access to things like early access to episodes, immediate access to multi-part episodes like the one that we're doing today because it's a heavy and a long one, fast tracking recommendations for future episodes, Q&A and AMA sessions, discounts on merch and tours whenever I have merch. And if you join my top tier Patreon, you get a shout out in every episode because you, my friend, are a gentle them and a scholar, and you deserve the utmost respect. So there are 4 tiers. There's the friend, which is just like, hey, happy to be here. Gonna throw a little support your way. There's the history buff, the history nerd, and the historian. Bottom tier is only $2, which is more than I spent at Dunkin' Donuts this morning. But I mean, that coffee was so worth it though, because I did a tour today and, yeah, definitely needed the caffeine. My brain was not with it after 3 hours of sleep last night because grad school is rough. I have like 11 more sources to read and like 3 days to do it. So I don't know. There's not enough hours in the day, but yeah, grad school's fun, guys. So if you want to join my Patreon, you can check the link in my description or go to patreon.com/effeduphistory. So shameless plug aside, sit back, relax, and practice your, oh good God, what the fuck faces. Okay. Well, I've gone back and forth on where to start my telling of this story, and I think I'm just gonna like follow the Greeks and do this in medias res style because It's a lot. So, the winter in Salem, Massachusetts, which I have yet to experience and slightly terrified of, can be frigid. And there isn't much to do when you have to stay inside all day long. So, in a Puritan village in the early 1690s, there was even less to do. And when there's nothing to do, people sometimes play with things they shouldn't. Some of the young girls decided that they wanted to have some supernatural fun. Now, this isn't something that new that people did or like exclusive to Puritan New England. I was reading about the prevalence of ghost stories in winter and playing with the supernatural and this affinity that is so common to people when everything around them is dying. And when the pagans were converting to Christianity, they were trying so hard to hold on to these traditions that some people think that that's where the concept of purgatory came from. These are obviously people who are skeptical of religion, but that's just a theory that takes up real estate in my brain. If you are Catholic, obviously, and there is a different theory behind that. But I mention this because, again, just like everything else, it isn't something new. It wasn't something that the Puritans liked, but it definitely happened, and it happened in more than just Puritan New England. So when Betty Parris and Abigail Williams and a few other girls from Salem Village dabbled in divination in the dead of winter in 1691 into the beginning of 1692, it wasn't totally preposterous. The girls spent a lot of their times doing things like Venus glass, which is where you drop an egg into water and then try to tell your future from the shapes that it makes. There are some sources that claim that Tituba, the Parris' slave, taught them this and that she had a lot of knowledge of magical practices, but there's no concrete evidence about this that I could find, at least at this time. Not to say it didn't happen, but it also might be attributed to her because she was a woman of color who was treated as an other in their society. There's no documentation of where she was from. Most people assume she was African, but some people think that she may have been from the Caribbean, part of the Arawak native tribe, which is like South America and Caribbean and Florida. And some people think that Betty Parris's father purchased her when he was in Florida and brought her here. Like, no idea of like her story, where she came from. No idea what happened to her after the Salem Witch Trials. She's kind of like this figure that's really lost to history. But anyway, there are some people who think that she taught the girls magic. Take that with a grain of salt. So regardless of who taught them, one night in the dark winter, the girls were playing Venus glass, asking about their future husbands because, you know, as a girl in Puritan New England, that's pretty much all you had going for you. When one of them saw a coffin where their husband's face should have been, which absolutely freaked them the fuck out. And soon after, 9-year-old Betty Parris started exhibiting strange symptoms. She'd hide under furniture and bark like a dog and complain that she felt feverish and scream and crying in pain. And then soon after that, 11-year-old Abigail started acting the same. And soon, like some sort of strange pandemic, other girls in the village started exhibiting these symptoms as well. And after a while, it wasn't going away. So Reverend Parris called a doctor, which most historians believe to have been Dr. Griggs, who examined them and couldn't figure out a cause. And, well, I'll let Reverend Hale describe it. Quote, "At length, one physician gave his opinion that they were under an evil hand. This the neighbors quickly took up and concluded that they were bewitched. Tituba and her husband, named Indian John," yes, his name was Indian John, "without the knowledge of their master or mistress, they had taken some of the afflicted person's urine and mixing it with meal had made a cake and baked it to find out the witch, as they said. And after this," Reverend Hale continues, "the afflicted person cried out of Tituba that she did pinch and prick and grievously torment them, and that they saw her here and there where nobody else could, yet they could not tell where she was and what she did when out of their humane sight. These children were bitten and pinched by invisible agents. Their arms, necks, backs turned this way and that and returned back again, so as it was impossible for them to do of themselves, and beyond the power of any epileptic fits or natural disease to affect. Sometimes they were taken dumb, their mouth flopped and their throats choked, their limbs racked and tormented so as might move a heart of stone to sympathize with them. with bowels of compassion for them. End quote. So Betty was sent to live with her father's cousin, Stephen Sewell, in Salem town, and the fits still continued while she was there. She said to Sewell's wife that, quote, the great black man came to her and told her that if she would be ruled by him, she should have whatever she desired and go to the Golden City. When she told Mrs. Sewell about it, Mrs. Sewell told Betty that that was the devil and she needed to deny him. And she did. And apparently he never bothered her again because even the devil understands consent. Then she wasn't a part of anything having to do with the witch trials ever again. She's mentioned in those initial symptoms and those initial accusations, but she didn't testify in court or accuse anyone else after those first 3 women. But the other girls sure do. Initially, there were 3 women who were accused, Tituba, like I already said, and then Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne. They were immediately examined the next day on March 1st, 1692, and while both of the Sarahs said that they were innocent, Tituba actually admitted to being a witch after she was tortured, because that was totally acceptable during this time, and in doing so, because there was that Christian witch theory that if there was one witch, there were multiple witches, she implicated other people in town. And then it just blew up from there. Over the next couple months, there were at least 60 people who were accused and thrown in prison. The 2 main judges at this point who were doing all of the examinations and the questionings were Judge John Hathorne and Judge Jonathan Corwin. But on May 27, 1692, the Court of Oyer and Terminer was established because up until this point, I read that there wasn't really an established legal court. I've read other writings of this time that talk about a quarterly court, like what we talked about in the Dorothy Talby case. So I'm assuming it was still like that during this time. In addition to Judge Hathorne and Judge Corwin, Nathaniel Saltonstall, Bartholomew Gedney, Peter Sargent, Samuel Sewell, Waite Still, Winthrop, and John Richards were also appointed as judges. And Lieutenant Governor William Stoughton was the Chief Justice. The actual governor of Massachusetts at this time, William Phipps, was more concerned with the issues that the colony was facing against the indigenous people, and basically told Stoughton that he needed to handle this issue in Salem and handle it as quickly as possible because there were more important things to look at than witches. On May 27, 1692, George Corwin is also appointed as sheriff. He's fun. We're going to have a whole episode on him because he is a peach. So Stoughton and the judges decided to make a couple interesting decisions when conducting these trials, including allowing spectral evidence, which are basically acts done by Satan or agents of Satan, including witches and the like, that are only seen by the people that it's happening to, if that makes sense. And I do want to say, in 1662, there was the Hartford witch panic in Connecticut, which again, if you want to hear the whole story, listen to the episode that I did about this, if you haven't already. And they initially also used spectral evidence, but they realized that it wasn't proper evidence and that it shouldn't be admissible in court. But when you're trying to prove something that is in the invisible world, as they described it, in Salem, they decided that it was totally acceptable. So the girl saying, hey, Tituba is hurting me. Ow, ow, ow. Don't you see her pinch me? Don't you see her hurting me? Was totally acceptable. 6 days after this court was established, Bridget Bishop was brought to trial after being arrested on April 18th. She was in her late 50s or early 60s at the time. Now, this was not the first time that she was in court. She married her second husband, Thomas Oliver, in 1666, and they fought a lot, physically and verbally. In 1670, they were fined for beating each other. And then in 1678, she found herself again in court for using foul language against her husband. The next year, he fell ill and died a few months later. His children accused Bridget of bewitching him to death, but that never actually went to trial. And most people believed that they were just trying to get her inheritance. She was arrested again in 1687 for stealing brass, but the records of how that ended have been lost to time. But sometime during this time in between, she married a man named Edward Bishop. This is where her story kind of gets confusing. It seems like she's often mistaken for her stepson's wife, who was married to Edward Bishop Jr., who sometimes didn't always go by the junior. So there's this story that Bridget Bishop was a tavern owner who wore extravagant colors and was a social outcast who lived in Salem Village and used to give alcohol to minors. But it seems like she wasn't any of that. She actually lived in Salem town. I had a local historian who told me that she had apple orchards in Salem town that are over by where the Salem jail was. And then there are sources that say that her home was on what is now Washington Street, which is like one of those main roads in downtown. It's actually the original road in downtown. So initially it was the only road. During her trial, Bridget continuously said that she was innocent, but many people testified against her, including Mercy Lewis, Abigail Williams, Elizabeth Hubbard, and Ann Putnam Jr. Those were the first accusers, but there were a lot more. Some of the evidence, including things like her bewitching children and other adults to death, sending deformed animals to do her bidding. Also, wild connections, like the time she asked a neighbor to dye some lace for her that they said was so small it couldn't be used for anything other than a poppet, which is kind of like what we would think of like a voodoo doll almost. And it just like goes on from there. She was found guilty on June 10th, 1692, and became the first victim of the Salem Witch Trials when she was hanged at Proctor's Ledge in Salem town. She was the only one who was executed by herself. All of the following executions happened in groups. And then after that, we have the trials of Susannah Martin, Rebecca Nurse, Sarah Good, Elizabeth Howe, and Sarah Wilds. So to kind of go through all of them, the reason I bunched them together is because they were all executed together. So we're going to give a little synopsis of each person and go into them a little bit more detail. Sarah Good was described as a poor and pregnant woman who would wander door to door asking for handouts when she was arrested on March 1st, 1692, being one of the first accused women. Her and her husband William were not very popular. She seemed to have a temper and was described by one woman in town as being, quote, spiteful and malicious. She was accused of witchcraft after she was refused entrance into a woman named Sarah Gadge's home. Allegedly, Sarah asked to enter, was denied, and then muttered something under her breath, and the next day, one of Sarah Gadge's cows died. While Sarah was in jail, her daughter Dorothy, also sometimes called Dorcas, was accused and also arrested for witchcraft as well, and she was only 4 years old. The little girl was accused by Mary Walcott, Ann Putnam Jr., and Mercy Lewis. Dorcas stayed in prison for 8 months and was so scarred for the rest of her life that she was never the same. During Sarah's trial, she claimed her innocence, but did accuse Sarah Osborne, the other woman arrested with her, and Tituba. During Sarah's trial, she claimed her innocence, but did accuse Sarah Osborne, the other woman who was arrested with her, who actually died in prison before she could be tried, which led to Sarah being convicted. But the courts did not want to be responsible for the death of a child, so they postponed her execution until after she gave birth to an infant who died in prison days later. That part is just astounding to me. Like, they didn't want to execute her while she was pregnant, which makes total sense. Like, I don't have a problem with that at all. But they let her give birth in prison and then didn't remove the child and let the baby die. And then once that baby died, they executed her. And when they executed her, her daughter was still in prison. Like, seriously, man. Sarah Good, I cannot wrap my head around the way that they treated that woman. But we will get to her a little bit more. She has some final words to say that we will get to in a moment. Susannah Martin didn't actually even live in Salem. She lived in Amesbury, which is about 30 miles north of Salem. But she was accused of witchcraft twice before 1692. First time it was said that she was tormenting a neighbor's wife, but she was released on bail and the charges were dropped. And in 1669, she was accused of birthing and killing an illegitimate child, but again, she posted bail and the charges were dropped. Afterwards, her husband died and she was left completely destitute. A lot of people think that it was her bad reputation that led to her accusation, because there's really no other reason besides that. So she was arrested on May 2nd, 1692. On trial, she laughed at the people who were accusing her because she thought that it was just so ridiculous. And she continued to claim her innocence. And even though there wasn't really a lot of evidence against her, she was found guilty. Elizabeth Howe lived in Ipswich, which is about 13 miles north of Salem. Just like Bridget Bishop and Susannah Martin, she wasn't this wasn't the first time that she was accused of witchcraft. She was accused of bewitching a child that later died, supposedly from these bewitchments. She was never arrested or charged for this. And although she was never charged, she was still denied membership to a church. And there was a lot more accusations of her like being a witch and enchanting different animals. She was arrested on May 29th, 1692. And her main accusers during her trial were Mary Walcott and Abigail Williams, who claimed that they were harmed by her, and she was found guilty. Sarah Wiles was in her 60s when she was arrested, and she also lived in Ipswich. And like so many other women, this was not the first time that she found herself in court. In 1649, she was arrested for fornicating out of wedlock. And then in 1663, she was arrested for wearing a silk scarf, which violated the sumptuary laws. I would have been arrested for so many things in the 1600s. She was also just like genuinely disliked by the community and involved in land disputes. She was arrested on April 22nd, 1692, and her main accusers were Ann Putnam Jr., Mary Walcott, and Mercy Lewis. She also never said that she was guilty and proclaimed her innocence, but the spectral evidence against her led to her conviction. Rebecca Nurse was 71 years old. Her sister, Mary Easty, was also later accused of being a witch. But unlike Susannah, Elizabeth, and Bridget, she was described as pious and upstanding. She was arrested on March 24th, 1692. She was accused by Ann Putnam Jr., and Abigail Williams, along with a couple others who claimed that her spirit tormented them. But a lot of people think that her accusation was largely due to the fact that there were some border disputes between her and the Putnam family, and there's some evidence that she chastised the girls for doing those divination activities like the Venus class, because that was work of the devil. Like, divination was not allowed. It says it in the Bible, and Puritans very hardcore followed the Bible. During her trial, she proclaimed her innocence and was actually found not guilty, which wasn't surprising considering that there was no evidence against her. But Lieutenant Governor William Stoughton was not okay with this and said that the jury must have missed the part of her statement where she was referring to another person that was awaiting trial in prison as, quote, one of us. So they asked her another question about that statement, one of us, and she didn't answer, which a lot of people think is just because she was deaf. She was very confused and trying to figure out what they were asking. And this just caused the jurors to briefly reconvene, change their verdict, and she was found guilty. After this, she actually wrote a letter saying that by the phrase one of us, she meant a fellow prisoner, not a fellow witch. But it did not matter, and she was executed. So one of George Corwin's jobs as sheriff was loading the convicted people that were due to be executed into a cart and lugging them the 1.5 miles or so to Proctor's Ledge, the execution site. From there, a man named Reverend Nicholas Noyes would try to get any last confession out of them. Now, most of these people, when they were convicted of being a witch, they were excommunicated from the church, so they weren't allowed to have any last rites or anything like that. That is something that the Bodies of Liberty established, and also the Witchcraft Act of 1604 with King James, that established it as well, that if you were convicted of being a witch, you weren't allowed to have any, what is it called, like the dying rites? What is that called? I can't remember. I cannot remember what that's called, but like the prayers that they say for you when you're dying, the last rites, is that what that is? I don't know. I could Google it, but I don't feel like it. So, legend says that when Reverend Nicholas Noyes asked Sarah Good if she had any last words that she wanted to say or if she wanted to confess, she screamed at him, quote, "I am no more a witch than you are a wizard. And if you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink." Remember that. If you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink. That's going to come back later. On July 19, 1692, Rebecca Nurse, Elizabeth Howe, Susannah Martin, Sarah Good, and Sarah Wiles were executed at Proctor's Ledge, hanged for witchcraft. So the treatment of these people was so bad that John Proctor wrote a letter to the Boston clergy that described how horrific it was and asked that the trials be moved to Boston where he thought that it might be better. He wrote, quote, "Reverend gentlemen, the innocency of our case with the enmity of our accusers and our judges and jury, whom nothing but our innocent blood will serve, having condemned us already before our trials, be so much incensed and enraged against us by the devil." He wrote that they needed to intervene to save their lives. And then he wrote about some of the torture in detail, saying that, quote, 2 of the 5 are young men who would not confess anything until they tied them neck and heels till the blood was ready to come out of their noses. And it is credibly believed and reported that this was the occasion of making them confess what they never did. And the same thing happened to his son, William. They attempted to keep his son like that for 24 hours before one of the magistrates decided to spare him. He finished his letter by saying, quote, if it cannot be granted that we can have our trials in Boston, we humble beg that you would endeavor to have these magistrates changed. Begging also and beseeching you would be pleased to be here, if not all, some of you, at our trials, hoping thereby you may by means of saving the shedding of our innocent blood. And then, about a week after, John Proctor was arrested, along with a bunch of other people. So John Proctor actually became the first male witch to be accused in Salem. He wasn't the last, because men and women were both accused and executed. Yes, I mean, it was mostly women, but like a quarter of the people accused and executed were men. So all of this talk of like, my heart goes out to the women who were executed in Salem. You need to also let your heart go out to the men as well. Like, yeah, it was like 70% women, but it was like 30% men. John Proctor was also not a young, attractive man who was sleeping with the adorable teenage Winona Ryder playing Abigail Williams, Arthur Miller. She was 11, and John Proctor was in his 60s. John Proctor was a farmer and a tavern owner, and he didn't believe in the witch trials. This is kind of where we see a little bit of a turn. The women who were executed up until this point, other than Rebecca Nurse, were not well liked and had a bad reputation, and many had witchcraft accusations against them. And then this is where we start seeing a little less of that and start seeing some people being targeted for opposing what was happening, like what Rebecca Nurse is said to have done. John Proctor said that the girls who were accusing these people were frauds and that they were lying. In March of 1692, his servant Mary Warren started acting like these other girls, and he beat her to try and get her to stop. The fits did eventually stop, and she nailed a note to the meeting house door asking for prayers and wrote, quote, the afflicted persons did but dissemble, which is very confusing. I have read that sentence over and over and over again, and I cannot figure out what she meant. She did not elaborate, but they thought that she meant that the girls were lying. And then she was later arrested and tried as a witch, as was John Proctor's pregnant wife, Elizabeth. He wasn't accused until after his wife was arrested, and he wrote that letter. So his wife, Elizabeth, was on trial, and the girls were saying that her specter was attacking them, and so was his. So he was arrested on April 11th, 1692, and convicted, as well as his wife. They stayed her execution because, just like Sarah Good, she was pregnant at the time, but he obviously was not, being a man. They didn't care about separating a father from his child, so that was totally fine. They also didn't care about separating a mother from her child, like, as long as the baby was alive, because they were clearly pro-life. And guys, my podcast might get taken down for these things that I say. So it was nice talking to you. If this gets taken down, thank you so much for listening. So even though John Proctor was convicted and executed, there was one positive that came out of this, and that was that the letter that he wrote actually ended up helping. A lot of members of the clergy in Boston read his letter and slowly began shifting their views on spectral evidence, and would eventually rule that it was inadmissible in court, but not before more people were executed. So we're going to finish talking about that. Next person on my list is Martha Carrier, who was a citizen of Andover, which is about like 17 miles northwest of Salem. She was in her early to mid 40s and was the mother of at least 6 children. The birth of her first child is where that talk and rumors about her began. So she married her husband, Thomas Carrier, on May 7th, 1674. And the first child was born on July 19th, 1674. Which anyone who has any basic knowledge of pregnancy and can do basic math can see that the baby was not conceived during their marriage. There's also evidence that at one point her and her family were banished from a town. So they were required to either like pay a fine or leave, and they chose to leave. We don't really know why, but it seems like it was because the family had smallpox and the town was trying to protect itself, but records are honestly kind of lacking. But in 1690, when they were living in Andover, there was another smallpox outbreak, and because of this possible former connection with smallpox, she was blamed for it. She was also later arrested for witchcraft on May 28, 1692, after being charged by Joseph Holton and John Walcott. During her examination, Abigail Williams, Elizabeth Hubbard, Susannah Sheldon, Mary Walcott, and Ann Putnam Jr. accused her specter of hurting them and that she was the cause of the death of 13 people in Andover, and that the girls could see their ghosts all around her and fell into fits. And she had a lot of people testify against her, and she was found guilty even though she never proclaimed that she was guilty. A lot of people think that the 13 ghosts that these girls were claiming that they saw were victims of smallpox who died. And because that smallpox epidemic was blamed on her, they said that she actually killed them through bewitchment. It wasn't like natural disease. It was caused by an actual person. John Willard was in his 30s when he was accused of being a witch and was the deputy constable of Salem. He was responsible for arresting the accused and bringing them to jail. There's not much that's really known about like the fine details of his life. He married a woman named Margaret Wilkins, who was described as the daughter of an established Salem village family. And they're documented to have had at least 3 children. He wasn't someone who's really like interested in farming or anything like that. He bought and sold small pieces of land. And when the accusations started and some of the girls started showing signs of their affliction, he actually felt really bad for them. He went to the Putnam home and expressed his sympathy for Ann Putnam Jr. and the whole family. And he was like for the witch trials at first. There's one account where in April he was having a conversation with someone and they were talking about the witchcraft trials and all the people who were accused. And he said like they should be hanged because they're witches and witches don't deserve to live. But soon after that, he started having a change of heart and doubting the legitimacy of everything when people that were respected in the village were being accused. And he refused to do his job. He didn't want to have any part of it anymore. And so he quit, which led to him being accused. He actually tried to escape, which a lot of people were honestly doing if they could afford it, but he was caught and formally arrested on May 10th, 1692. During his trial, the same child that he once expressed sympathy for, Ann Putnam Jr., accused him and damned him. Now, someone that he quarreled with also died while he was awaiting trial, so they determined that the cause of that was witchcraft. He proclaimed his innocence, like pretty much everyone else, until the very, very end. He spoke passionately about it too, like trying to make a good case for himself. And at one point, he was making such a strong case for himself and speaking so passionately that the judge interrupted him and told him, quote, "We do not send for you to preach, sir." And he was found guilty. He was the youngest person to be executed during the witch trials. George Jacob Sr. was in his 70s and was a farmer in Salem Village. When he was arrested for witchcraft, this, like many others, was not the first time that he was in court. He was known to have a bit of a temper. In 1674, he was sued by Nathaniel Putnam for chasing Putnam's horses that were allegedly on Jacob's property into the river, where they drowned. And then in 1677, he was fined for physical assault after he struck a neighbor. He was arrested on May 10th, 1692 for witchcraft and was accused by his servant, Sarah Churchill. He laughed during his testimony at the ridiculousness of it and proclaimed his innocence. But during this time, his granddaughter was also arrested and confessed that she was a witch and that her grandfather was also one, as was George Burroughs, who we'll be talking about in just a second. Many people testified against him, and during his physical examination, they found what was described as a witch teat on his shoulder that allegedly did not bleed, even when they pricked it with a pin. Which, I mean, that just kind of sounds like a skin tag to me, which is very common for a lot of people. Very common for older people to get skin tags as well, but to them it was a witch teat. And in addition, most people said that his specter would appear to them and beat them with his cane, and then he was found guilty. George Burroughs was 40 years old when he was arrested for witchcraft, and he was actually part of the clergy. He graduated from Harvard in 1670, married his wife Hannah in 1673, and then he moved to Maine. He was a pastor at a church up there until the entire village was raided by the Wabanaki tribe in August of 1676. So the few survivors of this raid actually relocated down to Salisbury, where he was minister there for the next 4 years until he was offered a job as the minister for Salem Village Church. Mercy Lewis, who was one of the main accusers during the witch trials, was a refugee from his village in Maine. She actually came to Salem Village with him and became his servant. So when he took over in Salem Village, there was a lot of fighting between Salem Town and Salem Village. There's this divide that happened during this time. Okay, so like Salem Town was the original settlement, and then as more people started moving there, they had to move farther and farther out, and they had to move farther away from the water. So there eventually started becoming this divide between Salem Town, which is now the city of Salem, which was on the water. They did a lot of trading. They built a lot of ships. They were usually really affluent, versus the people in Salem Village who were more inland, who were subsistence farmers pretty much. So there was this large divide during this time between like wealthy people who were like literally building mansions, and then people in Salem Village who barely had enough food to survive and were living in tiny shacks because they had to build everything themselves. So there was this huge conflict between the two of them. There was actually one letter that was written that described it as like brother against brother and neighbor against neighbor. So when George Burroughs took over, it was in the midst of all of this fighting. Salem Village had actually just ran the last minister out of town after they just stopped paying his salary. And then the same thing started happening to Burroughs. They stopped paying his salary, and he became so poor that in 1681, when his wife died, he didn't even have enough money to pay for her funeral. And so he borrowed it from the Putnam family. And by April of 1682, he quit his job as minister, and he left the town because the parishioners weren't paying him and he couldn't afford to live there anymore. So the next year, on May 3rd of 1683, he actually came back to Salem Village to try to settle his accounts. And John Putnam had him arrested for failure to repay him after his wife's funeral. 6 people from the town actually paid the bail to keep George Burroughs out of prison, and then collected money for him to pay off his debt. And although it was settled by the time he left, this may have like negatively impacted his reputation. He moved to Maine in 1690 and was arrested on May 4th, 1692 for witchcraft and brought all the way back to Salem. Allegedly, on that long trek back to Salem, there was a terrible thunderstorm, and they had to take shelter until it passed, and it was determined that the storm was caused by Satan to try to thwart them and allow for the Reverend to escape. Trippy, right? So when George Burroughs was examined, they asked him some pretty interesting questions. There were a lot of rumors that his house in Maine was haunted, which he denied, but he did admit that there were a lot of toads there, which are agents of the devil. Clearly, have you never seen a toad? Like, come on. He also couldn't remember the last time that he took communion, and his oldest son was his only child that was actually baptized. He's very evasive with a lot of his questions. So that really became a problem. He was a really private person in a role where you were expected to live very publicly and like be the shepherd to your flock and lead by example. And it was theorized that George Burroughs became this tool of the devil so that his elevated position in the community would allow him to influence those under him to become witches or agents of the devil. So this made his trial actually one of the most significant in the Salem Witch Trials. People before this were like outspoken in violence and against the trials, or were outspoken against the girls who were accusing all of them. And then here was this holy man on the stand being accused of being a witch and trying to influence all of his flock to do the same. There were actually 30 people who testified against him, and they all claimed spectral evidence. There was no concrete evidence about anything. They said that he had supernatural strength. They said that he would censor what his wives would say and like read all of their letters. And that even if they were to speak about him in another room or away from the home, he seemed to always know what they were saying about him. And he said that, quote, his God told him so. And in addition, he was also accused to murdering children, because why not just throw that in there as well? And he was convicted. And on August 19th, 1692, John Proctor, John Willard, Martha Carrier, George Jacob Sr., and Reverend George Burroughs were executed by hanging in Proctor's Ledge in Salem town. When it was George Burroughs' turn, he climbed the ladder, and Reverend Noyes asked him if he had any final words. And his last words was a speech that proclaimed his innocence one last time. And he ended the speech by reciting the Lord's Prayer perfectly, which is something that witches weren't supposed to be able to do. Documentation said that people looked on him with admiration while he was making this speech, and that people were literally brought to tears. And it seemed like people were heading towards wanting to stop the executions because, again, witches were not supposed to be able to say the Lord's Prayer. And then they executed him in the midst of this. So Cotton Mather, Certified Tool of the Year, 1692, who I may mention was not in Salem, but was actually in Boston and just came to witness this execution, addressed the crowd on horseback like fucking William Wallace or something, and told the people, "Don't be fooled. The devil clearly dictated it to him to bring these exact thoughts into your mind. And Satan himself can often be transformed into the angel of the light." And this, made people feel better about it, I guess. He basically was saying that, like, he didn't actually say the Lord's Prayer. Satan was the one who told him. He whispered it in his ear, and he just repeated it just to put doubts in your brains. And they believed it. And the executions continued. So this now brings our total to 11 people executed for witchcraft. None of them admitted to being a witch, all proclaiming their innocence. So let's just take a breath and continue, because this last little bit is a lot. So the next person that was killed during the witch trials was Giles Corey. So I'm going to be doing a whole episode on him because there's this myth of like the curse of Giles Corey that we're going to talk about. But he was the only person that was killed by the court who was not hanged during the witch trial. There were also people who died in prison, like we talked about, but they weren't really killed. They just sort of like died because of the circumstances and because of exposure. Giles Corey was actually killed. Like, his death was the direct cause of the choices of the court of Boyer and Terminer. So Giles Corey refused to admit that he was guilty, just like pretty much everybody else that we've talked about up until this point. And he was submitted to the peine forte d'or, which translates to like harsh punishment, pretty much. Basically, this is when there was a board placed on top of you and they piled stones on it until you talked and they got the answer that they wanted. So after 2 days of not speaking, Giles died. Like I said, there's a lot more to his story. We're going to be getting into him a little bit more because he has alleged significance, like even today. So yeah, we'll talk about him. But even though we're not really talking about him today, we will talk about his wife, Martha. So Martha had an interesting past. She was born around 1620, and then around 1640 or so, she had an illegitimate child, which was just a scandal. And even more of a scandal, that child was mixed race. And she named him either like Benjamin or Benoni based off of what sources you read. Again, we don't really know much more about her life up until the point where she got married to Giles in 1690 when she was in her late 70s and Giles was in his early 80s. She was really pious and really well respected in the community, but like so many before her, she was very outspoken. So when the witch trials started in 1692, Martha Corey spoke out against them. She didn't think that the accusations made against people were correct, or really that like witches even existed at all. And when her husband Giles would try to go and see what was happening with everything, she would hide his saddle, which honestly really worked against her. She denounced the trials and the main accusers and the judges that led to two of the young accusers, Ann Putnam Jr. and Mercy Lewis, turning their finger towards her. Many other people testified against her, including her husband, and she was found guilty for witchcraft. She also spent the longest time in Salem jail of those executed, being there for over 6 months after being arrested on March 19, 1692. Tituba was the one who was in jail longest period. She was one of the first people to go in and the last to go out over a year later. You had to pay your bill to be able to leave. Like, they literally charged you for everything. The conditions in the Salem jail were awful. They were small. It smelled like tobacco and shit. Some of the cells were so small that you couldn't even sit down comfortably, and you definitely couldn't lay down. You were denied water if you asked for it. Like, they gave you enough to survive, but if you were really thirsty and you needed it, they denied it to you. It was incredibly cold in the winter and incredibly hot during the summer. And if they gave you a meal, they would charge you for it. And if they gave you straw, like if you requested straw to make a bed to be a little bit more comfortable, they charged you for it. They charged you a bill for the handcuffs that they put on you. They charged you for your execution. And oftentimes to pay this, they would like confiscate some of your goods to pay off your bill. And if you didn't have any goods, like Tituba did not have, you just remained there. So we'll talk about a little bit more in the next episode, sort of like the aftermath of everything. But when all of the people were ordered to be let free, it's believed that Reverend Parris actually sold her to someone else, and that other person paid her bill. But again, we don't know who that was, and we don't know what happened to her afterwards. She's just this unfortunately lost person in history who some people think started the witch trial. Some people think that she accused people so that way she could like get back at the white people who oppressed her. I don't know if I fully believe that, but you know, nobody knows anything about her. Her entire life is speculation. It's like reading about like Sally Hemings and about how nobody knows what she looked like. And when she's often depicted at Monticello, she's depicted as a shadow or like a cameo, and you don't ever see her face. And like reading about Sally Hemings, I think about Tituba. It's that same sort of thing. She was just sort of this shadow, and we don't know anything about her. And the only thing that remains of her is just like some court documentation, and that's it. Margaret Scott was from Rowley, which is about 16 miles north of Salem. She was in her 70s and lived on land that she inherited from her husband, but when he died, he didn't really leave her with anything, so she started begging and asking her neighbors for assistance, which her neighbors did not like because they just decided to ignore the part in the Bible that said love thy neighbors, because they were just like outstanding Christians, obviously. Honestly, we don't really know much more about her because most of her trial records were lost. There was no arrest warrant, no transcript, no death warrant. She was probably arrested on August 14th based on the limited information that we have. There is a little bit of testimony from some of her neighbors and from Mary Warren, Elizabeth Hubbard, and Ann Putnam Jr., which again just included a lot of spectral evidence and said that she was like the cause of death of some cattle, and that was it. She was found guilty. And Putator, I think is how you pronounce it, was again in her 70s. There were a lot of older people who were accused during this time period. And I don't know why. I made a joke the other day that it was like life expectancy was so low during this time that maybe they thought they had to like sign a pact with the devil just so that they could live to be in their 70s. But I don't know, it's weird. A lot of older people, clearly witchcraft to be above the age of 50 during this time, I guess. But anyway, not much is known about her early life or her birthplace or her maiden name. Anne Pudetor was born somewhere in England. At some point, married a man named Thomas Greenslet. They had 5 children together. When he died, she actually became a midwife and a nurse. And as a nurse, met her second husband, Jacob Pudetor, who was a blacksmith. So when he died in 1682, she inherited all of his land and all of his money. She is arrested on May 12th, 1692, and accused by Mary Warren. She was examined and sent to jail in Boston, and then a lot of people actually think that she was released because she was examined again in July. Some of the testimony against her was about her work as a nurse. Like, she would come in and like try and help people that were sick, and then they would worsen, because that's often something that happens when you're sick. But because the Puritans didn't always understand the science behind sickness, she is blamed for things worsening. It was also suspicious that she was found to have had like ointments and oils in her home, which as a nurse, like, I'm not surprised by, but it was suspicious because they didn't know what the contents were. She told them that it was soap making supplies, but they didn't believe her. And then of course, there was all the spectral evidence against her and she was found guilty. Mary Parker was a widow from Andover. She was in her mid to late 50s and had 9 children. When her husband Nathaniel Parker died in 1685, he left her and their children actually a considerable amount of money and land, and she was really well respected. So no one honestly knows why she was accused. Like, she didn't have any issues with the law, she didn't have any land disputes, that was it. Like, nobody knows. In September, she was named by a 15-year-old boy and was arrested that same month. She denied all the charges but was found guilty, and it seems like, sort of analyzing the arrest dates and the execution dates, that she spent the least amount of time in jail, which was only about 20 days. Alice Parker was a fisherman's wife in Salem town. She might have been the daughter of Giles Corey. She was accused by Mary Warren and arrested on May 12th, 1692. Warren said that Alice made a poppet, which again is sort of like a voodoo doll, like what you would think of a voodoo doll, of Mercy Lewis. And then, of course, again, spectral evidence. Alice claimed that she was not guilty and denied everything, but she was found guilty. Wilmot Reed, which I've also read sometimes as Wilmot Reed, was a fisherman's wife, and she lived in Marblehead, which is the next town over. It's now like where all of the rich people live, which is kind of like interesting. They have 4 yacht clubs, and the town is smaller than Salem. Salem only has 40,000 people, and Marblehead is even smaller, and it has 4 yacht clubs. In 1692 is very different. Wilmot Reed was apparently very unpopular. She had a reputation of being familiar with the supernatural. She apparently cursed people and cursed infants. She curdled milk straight from the cow. She churned butter into blue wool and a couple other things. And the people of Marblehead just ignored it. They were like, oh, is that Wilmot? Like, cursing babies? Must be a Tuesday. Like, they were totally fine with it. She was just like that weird, quirky neighbor in town that everyone just kind of ignored. But the girls that accused so many other people, Ann Putnam Jr., Mary Walcott, Mercy Lewis, heard these rumors, and she was arrested on May 28th, 1692, and brought to Salem. Again, spectral evidence in addition to all of these accusations that were said about her in Marblehead, and she was found guilty. Mary Easty was the wife of a wealthy farmer and sister of Rebecca Nurse. She was in her late 50s when she was accused of being a witch. Her mother was also allegedly accused of being a witch, which is one of the things that stacked up against her and her sister. I mean, she was a well-respected person in Salem. And other than some land dispute issues between her family and the Putnams and being related to other people who were accused, historians cannot figure out why she was arrested. But she was on April 21st, 1692, and then she was released and then arrested 2 days later when Mercy Lewis continued to accuse her of tormenting her. A lot of people spoke out against Mary, claiming that her spectral evidence and like caused all of this sickness, and she was found guilty. But after she was found guilty, she filed 2 petitions against this. The first petition was ignored. But in the second, she wrote that she understood that even though she was innocent and that she was going to be executed, she urged the magistrates to think about what they were doing and to spare people going forward. And people were so distraught over her execution that there was hardly a dry eye in attendance. And I honestly can see why. Now, the last person we're going to talk about is Samuel Wardwell. He was 49 years old and was a carpenter for Andover. Again, with him, the records were kind of lost and nobody really knows why he was arrested. But what makes him different from the previous 19 victims that we've talked about is he actually confessed to being a witch. He said that he had signed a pact with the devil when he was unhappy with his life and told fortunes and practiced folk magic. He said that he was discontent because he was in love with a woman named Sarah Barker and she rejected him. And he was one of the only people that was convicted who wasn't indicted for spectral behavior on the day of his trial. He was still accused of spectral evidence in the past, but none happened when he was on the stand, which was like the first time that happened during the entire trials. So a lot of historians say that this was the point where they started kind of turning against spectral evidence. He was the only one who admitted that he was a witch, and that's because like up until this point, people who confessed survived. The Puritans had this like concept of forgiveness, which we'll talk about more, but basically like if you confess to a crime, you would still be convicted of it. You would still be punished for it, but it wouldn't be as extreme, basically. But unlike the other people who admitted their guilt, he was found guilty and sentenced to death. On September 22nd, 1682, Wilmot Read, Mary Easty, Martha Corey, Anne Putitor, Margaret Scott, Alice Parker, Mary Parker, and Samuel Wardwell were executed by hanging at Proctor's Ledge. Reverend Noyes is said to have looked at their hanging bodies and said, quote, "What a sad thing it is to see 8 firebrands of hell hanging there." What a peach. But I told you, remember Sarah Good's last words. She said, "I am no more a witch than you are a wizard, and if you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink." Well, when he died in 1717, it seemed like he had like a stroke or an aneurysm, and that burst blood vessels in his mouth. And when he was found, he had blood in his mouth, and some people thought that he actually choked on his own blood. So, was this the curse of a witch? Was this a coincidence? I will leave that for you to decide. And Wilmot, Mary Easty, Martha, and Margaret, Alice, Mary Parker, and Samuel were the last people to be executed during the witch trials. And I think that's where we're going to stop today. There is more to the story when it comes to like the aftermath and causes, but this episode has been so heavy. So let's take a break and pick it up next time. So until then, thank you so much for listening today. If you like what you heard, if you can like what you heard today, and want to hear more, please subscribe or leave a review or sign up for my new Patreon at patreon.com/effeduphistory. If you have any stories from history or mythology that you'd like to hear me discuss, please reach out. I think I only have like 4 or 5 stories planned left, which includes part 2 of this episode. And I have no idea what I'm doing after this. Like, I'm going to go back like to like mythology or like the really, really messed up stuff, like get really fucked up with the Effed history. So if you have any ideas of like really, really messed up stories, please email me at effeduphistory@gmail.com, or you can reach out on any of my social medias at effeduphistory. And if you find yourself in Salem, sign up for a tour. You can sign up for a tour at whimsicalwitchma.com. You can also, I'm on TripAdvisor now as well, so you can sign up through TripAdvisor too. I offer 2 tours, a daytime tour that talks about women's history and witchcraft, And then I offer an evening tour called Curses and Crimes, where I talk about the darker side of Salem's history. And remember, history may be watching you, so don't fuck it up. Bye.